The basement of Holloway's Sons smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, and the particular mustiness of canvases that had been breathing for centuries. 3 floors above, crystal chandeliers were being polished for the Black Gold Charity Gala. Champagne was being chilled in silver buckets. Musicians were tuning instruments that cost more than Clara Whitmore would earn in a decade of 16-hour days bent over other people's masterpieces, repairing cracks that no one would thank her for fixing, stabilizing pigments that no plaque would ever acknowledge her preserving. Down here, in the concretine pipe sanctuary that everyone forgot existed, Clara stood before an easel and let her brush hover a millimeter above canvas she had been bringing back from the edge of dissolution for 4 months. Winter Garden, 1967. Eleanor Whitmore's final completed work. Her grandmother's farewell to the medium that had defined 60 years of vision, executed in the last months before the illness took her hands. Signed with tremor that Clara could feel in her own fingers every time she touched the surface. The painting wasn't supposed to exist. According to every auction record, every catalog raisonné, every art history textbook that mentioned the Whitmore collection at all, Winter Garden had been destroyed in a studio fire in 1968, 3 months after Eleanor Whitmore's death. Conveniently, before anyone could ask inconvenient questions about where the rest of the collection had gone. If you've ever been the person doing the work while someone else accepts the applause, subscribe now. We tell stories about invisible hands that built empires and what happens when they stop being invisible. Clara set down the brush. The gala was tonight. The painting her grandmother's painting. The painting she had grown up seeing in photographs her mother kept hidden in a shoebox. The painting that Holloway's Sons was advertising as the mystery headline lot of their most prestigious auction in 40 years will be unveiled before 200 of the wealthiest collectors in America. Conrad Holloway III would give a speech about Providence mysteries and the thrill of discovery. Beatrice Ashford would wear something devastating and stand too close to Julian Thorne, who was technically engaged to her and perpetually looked like a man sitting through his own funeral. And somewhere in that glittering chaos, Clara Whitmore, the basement girl, the invisible restorer, the employee whose name appeared on no payroll above the ground floor, would either watch her grandmother's lives work get sold to strangers who would never know whose hands created it, or she would do the thing she'd been preparing for since the day Margie O'Connell slipped her the internal memo confirming what she had already suspected. She crossed to the safe mounted in the brick wall, spun the combination, opened it. Inside, nestled beside her grandmother's pearl earrings never worn, waiting in a photograph of Eleanor in her garden alive. Smiling, the image Clara carried in her wallet, lay the envelope, cream-colored paper. Heavy, wax seal bearing the Whitmore crest of phoenix rising, the family motto card below Veritas per Ardua, truth through adversity. The seal had been broken once, when Clara first received it from Reginald Ashworth's office 3 days after her grandmother's funeral. Resealed since then. Carried in her bag through every day of the 5 years she had spent working in the building that housed stolen property she couldn't prove was stolen. Until tonight. Tonight, the letter came out. Tonight, everyone learned what Eleanor Whitmore had written in her final weeks. And tonight, Claire would find out whether truth through adversity was actually achievable, or whether the people with the money and the names and the chandeliers simply won because they always had. Do you believe in ancestral justice? That the sins of fathers eventually find their daughters' hands to correct? Comment karma if you're here for the long game payoff. She hadn't planned any of this. The job at Holloway's Sons had been desperation, a road, scholarship abandoned when her mother's medical bills consumed everything. A degree in art conservation traded for a classified as seeking experienced restoration technician. Discretion required, references essential. She had walked into the basement interview in her best blazer outlet, 23, clearance rack, and sat across from Margie O'Connell, who had looked at her resume and then at her face and said, "You're Eleanor Whitmore's granddaughter, aren't you?" The question had frozen her mid-breath. Margie had closed the folder, leaned forward, said quietly, "I worked with your grandmother on the 1982 Sotheby's valuation. She was the finest I ever knew. Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you're here. And I won't tell anyone who you are unless you want me to. 5 years." Margie had kept that promise through promotions Clara never got, through credit for restorations that went to associates who couldn't tell a varnish from a veneer, through salary increases that evaporated into administrative adjustments that no one could explain. Margie had also, quietly, systematically, been feeding Clara information, internal memos about acquisition sources, photographs of condition reports that didn't match the artworks they described, the name of the appraiser who had certified the Whitmore collection as destroyed by a fire, a man who had retired to Portugal 6 months after that certification, and whom Conrad Holloway had visited twice in the ensuing years. According to travel logs, Margie shouldn't have had access to, but did because she had been cataloging Holloway's archives since before Conrad's father ran the place, and nobody remembered to change her password. And then there was Julian, the heir who wandered into the basement sometimes on the pretext of checking inventory, who asked questions about binding media and pigment stability that no one at his level had ever cared about before, who sat on a stool in her studio and listened to her explain why a particular canvas couldn't be restored with synthetic varnish without risking ultraviolet degradation over the next 50 years, and who nodded like she was teaching him something precious instead of reciting technical trivia. He didn't know her full name. She didn't know his. They existed in that basement as two people who had found each other in the dark, talking about art like it mattered, while above them the machinery of commerce ground forward indifferent to meaning. She had fallen in love with him somewhere between the Baroque canvas and the Flemish triptych, in the space of shared sentences about beauty and permanence, and why people created things they knew wouldn't last. She had never told him who she was. He had never told her he was Conrad Holloway's son. They had been protecting each other from realities that seemed, in that basement, very far away. Have you ever fallen in love with someone without knowing who they really were? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear the wildest, I had no idea stories. Best one gets pinned. The transformation began at 6 o'clock. Clara locked the basement studio for the last time, or what she hoped would be the last time, depending on how the evening went, and climbed the service stairs to the street level, exiting through a door that opened onto an alley where delivery trucks idled and nobody looked at you twice. Her apartment was 6 blocks away. A studio that cost more than it should because it was in a neighborhood that had decided to become fashionable, with water-stained ceiling tiles and a cracked full-length mirror and a closet containing exactly one item. She had never worn a garment bag, preserving her grandmother's wedding reception gown from 1964, emerald silk, couture, the kind of dress that had been handmade by a designer whose atelier no longer existed, fitted to Eleanor's measurements, preserved in acid-free tissue for the daughter she had been estranged from and the granddaughter she had never met in person, but had written letters to every birthday until dementia made writing impossible. Clara had tried it on once. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, had stood before the cracked mirror in emerald silk that fit perfectly same height, same build, the jeans skipping a generation with eerie precision, and cried for an hour because the woman in the mirror looked like someone who belonged in rooms she had always been excluded from, and she hadn't been ready to be that woman yet. Tonight, she was ready, or as ready as she would ever be. The dress slid on like water. The pearl simple studs, matching set, the last things Eleanor had bought before the medical bills consumed everything, went into her ears with hands that trembled slightly. The gold band stayed on her right hand, non-negotiable, her grandmother's wedding band, given to Clara on her 18th birthday with instructions to wear it always. And remember that the people who look down on you will one day look up, and you must be ready to meet their eyes when they do. She looked in the mirror, the same face, the same gray-blue eyes, the same honey blonde hair, released from its practical bun into waves she had forgotten she had. But the woman in the emerald gown with the pearls at her throat and her grandmother's band on her hand, and the sealed envelope in her evening bag, that woman was not invisible. That woman was impossible to overlook. That woman was going to walk into Black Gold Charity Gala and watch Conrad Holloway try to sell her grandmother's final painting to strangers, and then she was going to decide what kind of person she wanted to be, the one who stayed silent and disappeared back into the basement, or the one who stood up and made them see her for the first and last time. Subscribe now if you want to watch an invisible woman become impossible to ignore. The best transformations happen when you stop hiding and start arriving. The gallery had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers blazed from ceilings that usually fluoresced with institutional lighting. Round tables draped in black linen gleamed with gold flatware. Centerpieces of white roses climbed toward the ceiling in arrangements that probably cost more than Clara's annual salary. An orchestra played something by Strauss in the corner. Musicians in formal were producing music that drifted like expensive perfume over the assembled guests. 200 people, collectors, curators, journalists from Arts Antiques and the magazine Antiquarian, and 3 European publications Clara recognized from her days dreaming of academic careers she had had to abandon. People whose names appeared on museum boards and foundation letterheads, and the kind of society pages that still existed in enclaves where old money pretended it wasn't crumbling. Clara entered through the service door out of habit, then stopped, corrected course, walked to the main entrance, and stepped through it like a guest, like someone who belonged. The doorman hesitated. Her face wasn't on the list. He could recall, but something in her posture, the gown, the pearls, the absolute certainty of her stride, made him step aside rather than challenge. She was through, inside, breathing air that cost $400 per ticket and smelled of money and ambition, and a particular desperation of people who needed everyone to know they could afford to be here. The artworks were displayed on pedestals and walls throughout the space, each one spotlighted like a jewel. Clara walked past them slowly, recognizing each piece. The Venetian landscape she had spent 11 weeks stabilizing the cracking paint on. The Rococo portrait whose torn canvas shed woven back together thread by microscopic thread. The abstract expressionist work whose layers of oxidized varnish shed, removed with solvents that required ventilation protocols Shed had to fight for because Conrad wouldn't approve the equipment budget. None of them credited her. The placards named the previous owners, the estimated values, the attributions to long-dead artists. Nowhere, anywhere, did the words "restore by" appear. She was accustomed to this. It didn't hurt less tonight, but she was accustomed to it. Then she saw it, the headline lot, displayed alone on a raised platform draped in black velvet, cordoned off with velvet ropes like a shrine, illuminated by a dedicated spotlight that made everything else in the room look dim by comparison. Winter Garden, 1967. Eleanor Whitmore, her grandmother's painting, hanging in public for the first time in 40 years. Looking exactly as Clara had left it on the easel 3 days ago, luminous, alive. The late winter light captured in oil and brilliance. The garden path winding to her figure who might have been Eleanor herself, might have been death, might have been the future reaching back to claim the painter who had known it was coming. Clara stood before it for a long moment. Guests flowed around her like water around a stone. Someone complimented her dress. Someone asked if she was with one of the houses. She smiled vaguely and drifted close to the back wall, positioning herself where she could see everything: the stage where Conrad would speak, the table where Julian sat with Beatrice's crimson gown, predatory smile, hand on his arm like marking territory, the bar where Margie was stationed. Their eyes met. Margie's widened, traveled down to the gown, traveled back to Clara's face, and her hand rose to cover her mouth in shock or delight or both. The orchestra shifted to a new piece. The champagne continued to flow. And at precisely 8 p.m., Conrad Holloway III ascended the stage, adjusted the microphone, and began the speech that would change everything. If you're feeling the tension building, hit the like button. We're approaching the moment that makes or breaks everything. Your engagement fuels what comes next. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished collectors, friends of Holloway's sons. Conrad's voice filled the room with the confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged in his own house. Tonight represents the culmination of a dream. 40 years ago, my father acquired a collection of extraordinary works, the Whitmore Assembly, as it was then known, from a period of great uncertainty in the art world. These paintings were believed lost, destroyed, according to contemporary records. And yet, he gestured toward the spotlighted painting. Here it is, Winter Garden, 1967, by Eleanor Whitmore, a miracle of preservation, a triumph of rediscovery. And tonight, the centerpiece of an auction that will establish once and for all Holloway's sons' preeminence in the world of American collections. Murmurs of appreciation, polite applause, Beatrice clapping with exaggerated enthusiasm, her diamonds catching the chandelier light, Julian looking at the painting with an expression Clara couldn't quite read from this distance, and Conrad, swelling with a particular pleasure of a man about to make millions from property he had acquired through means that would never survive scrutiny. The provenance of this work, Conrad continued, has been the subject of considerable scholarly interest. The circumstances of the 1968 studio fire that reportedly destroyed much of Whitmore's output remain. Actually, the voice came from Clara's left. Not loud, but clear enough to cut through Conrad's cadence. Everyone turned. Beatrice turned fastest, her eyes narrowing as they found Clara in the emerald gown, and something calculated moved behind her expression like a predator sighting unexpected prey. "I'm sorry," Beatrice said, her voice carrying perfectly, "but I believe we have a situation that requires attention before the auction proceeds." Conrad's smile flickered. "Miss Ashford?" "This woman." Beatrice pointed. Every eye in the room followed her finger to Clara. "Is not a registered guest. She is a former employee who was terminated this afternoon for attempting to fabricate provenance documentation regarding this very collection. She has a documented history of fraudulent claims connecting herself to the Whitmore family." Beatrice produced her phone, held it up. "I have the correspondence here. She's been attempting to infiltrate our events for months." The room erupted. Not loudly, this was not that kind of crowd, but with the murmurous tide of scandalized whispering that flows through rooms where reputation is currency. Clara felt 200 pairs of eyes turned toward her, felt the weight of attention she had never been trained to carry, felt, with sudden clarity, exactly how much Beatrice had prepared this, the speed of the fabrication, the specificity of the lies. This wasn't opportunistic humiliation. This was engineered destruction, planned and timed for maximum exposure. This is the moment. If you've ever been falsely accused in front of people who mattered, you know exactly what's happening in Clara's chest right now. Drop a if you're feeling this with her. Conrad recovered quickly. Too quickly, Clara noted, as if hadn't known this was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. Security will escort the individual from the premises. We cannot have persons attempting to compromise the integrity of our auction process through deceptive practices." He descended from the stage, approached Clara with a particular loathing of a man whose authority had been inconvenienced, and stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne and the wine on his breath. "I don't know who told you could come here tonight," he said quietly, for her ears only, "but your little fantasy ends now. You're nothing. You were nothing. And when you're gone, nobody will remember your name." Clara looked at him, looked at the painting behind him, her grandmother's garden, her grandmother's path, her grandmother's hand reaching toward a future that had arrived at last. Looked at Julian, frozen at his table, his face a war between instincts she could read because she had spent months learning to read him in a basement where neither of them wore masks. Looked at Beatrice, whose smile had achieved a new width, the smile of a woman who had just gotten away with something monstrous and was savoring the taste. And Clara reached for her evening bag. Beatrice's hand shot out. "I believe that belongs to us now. Evidence." The bag was wrenched from Clara's grasp, rooted through with the efficiency of someone who had practiced this moment. The envelope emerged. Heavy cream paper. Wax seal. Conrad's name. "What's this?" He held it up mockingly, turning for the crowd to see. More forgery? Another desperate attempt to manufacture connection to a family that wouldn't have acknowledged you? How utterly pathetic. He didn't open it. Handed it to the security guard approaching. "Keep this. Evidence of fraudulent activity. Now remove her." Hands on her arms. Firm, professional, the grip of people who were just doing their jobs and didn't know they were committing the mistake that would end careers. Clara allowed herself to be guided toward the door, allowed her feet to move, allowed the emerald gown to sweep across the marble that her grandmother's money had probably helped purchase, past the artworks her hands had saved, past the table where Julian still hadn't moved, past Margie whose hands were pressed to her mouth and whose eyes were bright with tears she was fighting to contain. At the door, Clara stopped, turned. The security guards paused something in her posture, making them hesitate. The room, which had begun to turn away, to dismiss her, to forget her, found its attention drawn back by the quality of her stillness. "That painting," Clara said, her voice carried, not loud, just clear, the clarity of someone who had practiced these words for years and was finally releasing them, "was stolen from my grandmother 40 years ago by Conrad Holloway's father. It was listed as destroyed to prevent her from reclaiming it. Every painting in that collection belongs to me, and the letter you're holding, the letter you're too arrogant to read, proves all of it." She met Conrad's eyes across the room, held them. "Read it. I dare you. Read it in front of everyone here." and then explain why Holloway Sons have been accepting anonymous donations from the woman you just called pathetic for the past 5 years. She walked out. The door closed behind her, and inside the gallery, in the sudden terrible silence, someone started to move toward Conrad. It was Margie, small, sturdy, invisible Margie O'Connell, who had cataloged 32 years of Holloway secrets and was done watching them destroy good people. Mr. Holloway, her voice shook. Sir, with all due respect, read the letter. That moment right there, read the letter. If your heart isn't pounding, check your pulse. Share this video if you believe in the long game. The payoff is coming. Conrad stared at her, the mockery dying in his expression as something else replaced irritation, then impatience, then a flicker of something that might have been the first seed of doubt he had entertained in decades. This is evidence of fraud, Margaret, not story time. Read it. Margie's voice cracked on the second word. Please, sir, before you do anything else, read what it says. The room had gone completely silent. 200 people watching Conrad Holloway III hold a sealed envelope and argue with a woman half his size about whether to open it. The orchestra had stopped playing. Even the bartenders had paused, with theatrical side the sigh of a man indulging foolishness, so he could dismiss it more thoroughly. Afterward, Conrad broke the wax seal. The room waited. He extracted the letter, unfolded it, began to read aloud, his mocking tone intended to entertain. I, Eleanor Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, his voice faltered, do hereby declare and testify that the collection of works known as the Whitmore Assembly, including but not limited to the work titled Winter Garden, 1967, was obtained by Holloway Sons through deliberate misrepresentation of provenance, falsification of destruction documentation, and coercive exploitation of my financial vulnerability during the period of my illness. The color began to drain from Conrad's face. I further declare that my granddaughter, Clara Whitmore, is the sole lawful heir to all works described in Schedule A attached hereto, and that any sale, auction, or transfer of said works without her express consent constitutes theft under both civil and criminal statute. His voice had become a monotone, a man reading his own death warrant, and unable to stop. This testimony is executed of my own free will, witnessed and notarized, and shall remain sealed until such time as my granddaughter determines that the truth. He stopped. The letter trembled in his hand. The main doors opened. Reginald Ashworth entered, briefcase in hand, silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers, the kind of calm that preceded earthquakes. Additionally, his voice filled the silence Conrad had created. I can attest that the anonymous donation of $12 million to Holloway Sons in October 2021, which prevented the firm's bankruptcy proceedings, originated from the Eleanor Whitmore Trust, administered by Ms. Clara Whitmore, who has been, for the past 5 years, the largest single benefactor of this institution, while being paid a restorer's salary and treated as invisible by every person in this room who benefited from her generosity. The silence that followed was not the silence before. That had been the silence of theater, of anticipation, of a crowd waiting for the next act. This was the silence of a vacuum collapsing, of foundations giving way, of 200 people simultaneously understanding that everything they thought they knew about the evening, about the painting, about the woman, about the firm hosting them had been constructed on lies so extensive that the truth was dismantling reality in real time. Team Clara, or Team, I can't believe this is happening. Declare your allegiance right now in the comments. The war for justice is being won. The doors open again. Or maybe they'd never quite closed. Clara had been waiting just outside, the way she had waited 5 years, the way her grandmother had waited 40. She entered in the emerald gown that cost nothing and was worth everything. The pearls caught the chandelier light. The gold band on her right hand caught it too. And her face, the same face that Conrad had called pathetic, that Beatrice had called fraudulent, that 200 people had watched being escorted out like criminal trash, was perfectly composed, perfectly calm. The face of a woman who had waited for this moment and was not going to waste on theatrics. The crowd parted. Not physically, there was no shoving, no dramatic clearing, but the gravitational orientation of the room shifted. Bodies turned, attention focused. The woman in emerald walking toward the stage where Conrad still stood, letter in hand, looking like a man who had just discovered that the earth beneath his feet was not ground but thin ice over very deep water. She reached him, stopped. The chandelier light found her, illuminated her, made the emerald glow like something alive. Behind her, the painting Winter Garden, 1967 blazed in its spotlight, her grandmother's hand reaching toward the future that had finally arrived. "You call me a fraud," Clara said. Her voice was not loud. "It didn't need to be. You called my grandmother's lives work stolen property. You had every right to sell. You had me dragged out of a gala. I had more right to attend than anyone in this room." She paused. Let the silence hold. "Shall we discuss what happens now?" Conrad's mouth worked. Nothing emerged. Beside her, she was aware of Beatrice backing away, of Julian standing motionless with an expression she couldn't bring herself to read yet, of Margie wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand, of 200 guests whose smartphones had emerged almost simultaneously because some stories were too big not to document. Clara turned to face the room. This painting Winter Garden, 1967, was the last work my grandmother completed before your host convinced her to consign her collection for sale, then claimed it was destroyed, then kept it for 40 years waiting for values to appreciate. It belongs to me. I could simply take it. She reached to a nearby table, picked up an auction paddle. Number 1. But that's not how this works. I'll buy it. Fair market value. From Holloway Sons. Every dollar goes to the staff pension fund that Conrad had been promising for 15 years and never funded. She raised the paddle. Do I hear an opening bid from the current possessor of stolen property? Silence. Conrad couldn't bid. Bidding admitted he possessed it. Not bidding admitted defeat. The mathematics of checkmate expressed in the universal language of auction silence. No bids? Clara's voice carried particular warmth of someone enjoying justice the way fine wine is enjoyed slowly, deliberately, with full appreciation of every note. Going once. The chandeliers blazed. The painting gleamed. 200 people held their breath. Going twice. She brought the paddle down. Sold. To the lady in emerald. For the price of doing the right thing. She turned back to Conrad, who had aged 20 years in the past hour, whose face had the gray pallor of a man watching his legacy become his obituary. You'll receive a full accounting of every donation made by the Whitmore Trust. You'll receive notice of the Providence Challenge in filing with the Art Recovery Commission tomorrow morning. And Yushi leaned closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear, will explain to my face why my grandmother's letters to your father, begging for the return of her work, went unanswered for 37 years while you displayed her paintings at galas and toasted your own brilliance. She stepped back, straightened her gown, looked at the painting one more time, her grandmother's garden, her grandmother's path, her grandmother's hand reaching forward at last. Then she walked out, not toward the service exit this time, through the main doors, into the night, into whatever came next. If that entire sequence didn't satisfy something deep in your soul, I don't know what will. Like this video if you're feeling particular pleasure of watching arrogance collapse under the weight of its own lies. The basement was quieter than she remembered, or maybe she was just hearing it differently now as a place she was leaving, not a place that contained her. Her things were packed in a single box of brushes, the magnifying lamp, the reference books she had accumulated, the photograph of Eleanor that had lived on her desk for 5 years. The easel stood empty. The canvas was gone. She had bought it back too, in the final accounting, along with 2 other Whitmore works that had surfaced in Holloway storage. They were hers now, legally, documentedly, irrevocably. She was removing her pearl earrings when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Didn't turn around immediately. Knew who it was from the cadence. The same rhythm she had learned to recognize over months of basement conversations. The pace of someone who was nervous about arriving and reluctant to leave. The woman in the basement. Julian's voice came from behind her, slightly above, as he descended the last few steps. Who knew about chiaroscuro and pigment binding, and why Vermeer's grays can't be replicated with modern materials? Clara turned, saw him standing there, bow tie undone, jacket missing, the air armor stripped away somewhere between the gala and here. He looked like someone who had realized, too late, that had been wearing costume his whole life, and was only now figuring out what was underneath, the heir to Holloway Sons. She kept her voice neutral. Who asked questions because he actually wanted answers? I should have said something tonight. When they accused you, I should have. I know. I'm sorry. I know that too. She watched him struggle with the inadequacy of apology against the magnitude of complicity. What happens now? To you? To this place? It depends. He took another step closer. Not touching yet, earning proximity. On whether you'll let me earn the conversation we should have been having. In this basement, where you're actually yourself. Where I was starting to be myself before I forgot how? Clara considered him. The man who hadn't saved her at the gala but had shown up anyway, afterward, in the place where they'd actually met. The man who had listened to her talk about art like it mattered when no one else ever had. The man who might be capable of becoming someone worth knowing if he was willing to do the work. She reached into her bag, pulled out the copy of the letter, not the original. That was evidence now. But the copy Reginald had made for her, the one with Eleanor's handwriting preserved on paper that she could touch without compromising anything, held it out to him. My grandmother wrote this. It's not just about the painting. It's about believing that art matters more than money, that the hands that create matter more than the names that sell, that truth matters more than convenience. She watched him take it, watched his fingers close around the paper like it was something fragile and precious. I need to know which man you are, Julian, the one they're raising you to be, or the one who came to the basement because he wanted to understand something real. He looked at the letter, didn't read it yet, just held it, looked at her. Can I call you tomorrow? After you've slept? After I've figured out what I want to say? Clara allowed herself something that had been waiting inside her for hours, maybe for years. A smile, small, real. The first one that wasn't about vengeance or vindication or the satisfaction of plans executed. Tomorrow, he left. She heard his footsteps ascending, fading, the basement returning to its familiar quiet. She looked at the empty easel, the pack box, the photograph of Eleanor, still on the desk, still smiling, still proud in the way that grandmothers are proud of grandchildren they never got to watch grow up. She touched the gold band on her right finger, picked up her box, walked up the stairs, and they stood together at the railing of a building she owned, watching the city she was learning to love light up around them. And it wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't closure, and it wasn't the neat resolution that stories like to promise. It was a beginning, complicated, tentative, earned. That moment on the rooftop, is it romantic redemption or too little too late? I have my opinion. Best comment gets pinned. The debate starts now. Monday morning arrived with the particular clarity of autumn in New York. Clara walked through the front entrance of Van Holt Auction House for the first time in 5 years, through the door reserved for clients and VIPs. The security guard at the desk, a man named Deshawn who had held elevators for her 1,000 times without ever learning what she actually did there, stood as she approached. Didn't quite know what to do with his body. Settled on a nod that acknowledged something had changed without specifying what. Ms. Ashworth, welcome back. The name sounded strange, like wearing a coat she'd outgrown, like stepping into shoes she had left by the door years ago and forgotten were there. She would get used to it, or she wouldn't. Either way, it was hers now, the name, the legacy, the collection, the share of this building, the platform to rebuild everything Cornelius Van Holt had tried to erase. Her father's reputation would be restored. The Verazzi attribution would be corrected to acknowledge Edgar Whitmore. The textbooks would be updated. The lies would be buried under the weight of truth. And Cornelius would face whatever justice the courts and the art community and the weight of his own conscience could muster. But that was tomorrow's work. Today's work was simpler. Clara descended to the basement laboratory, the same 3,000 square feet of pristine climate-controlled space, the same smell of linseed oil and beeswax and chemical bite, the same clinical lighting that rendered color perfectly, that showed canvas and pigment, and the truth of what hands had wrought with nothing to hide behind. Her workstation was exactly as she had left it. The Dutch landscape, half restored, waited patiently, her tools arranged in their precise formation, her logbook open to the last entry. She sat down, picked up her brush, and went back to work, because some things hadn't changed. Some things never would. She was still the girl who fixed what others broke. Still the daughter of a man who painted truth into his canvases and trusted that someday someone would learn how to read it. Still someone who believed that broken things deserved to be made whole, that lies eventually collapsed under their own weight, that the truth was patient and stubborn and would wait as long as it took to be heard. The brush touched canvas, the first stroke of repair, the first act of making something damaged into something whole again. And somewhere, in whatever came after, her father was proud. If you stayed until the end, if you felt the humiliation, cheered the proof, cried at the rooftop, and hoped for the kiss that's coming, you're exactly who this channel was built for. Subscribe now. Join the community that believes the truth wins. And it'll see you in the next story about someone else who was counted out, counted on, and counted every cost to come back stronger. Until then, may every lie you've been told about yourself crumble under the weight of the person you actually are.